You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today, returning to the podcast, is Phil Magnus of Berry College. Phil, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So our topic for today is going to be the public choice economics of higher education. So, Phil, why don't you start us off by saying how this research project of yours, a lot of it is done with along with Jason Brennan, another previous guest of this show. How did this research project get started?
Well, I guess it started a couple of years ago when myself and Professor Brennan, who's at Georgetown, we both began researching into some aspects of the academic workforce. So how professors are hired, what rates they're being hired at. And there was a big controversy raging at the time, still actually kind of raging, about the growth of the adjunct workforce. And these are part-time professors who don't really have much in the way of job security, get paid significantly less than a typical full-time professor. And there were a lot of claims that were coming out around 2010 through 2012 is when this kind of peaked, that the adjunct workforce was taking over the universities. In other words, tenure was on the decline, full-time positions were supposedly on the decline, and everything was being adjunctified. This was the narrative that was really pervasive in the higher ed literature. And we started digging into this in some greater depth, focusing upon what the numbers actually said. And it turned out that there was a lot of misrepresentation of what was really going on. Even though adjunct hiring had boomed in the past 20 to 30 years, and especially the past 10 years, what was really going on is these were supplemental hires to a very traditional growth pattern. And we discovered, poking around in the data, that higher ed has maintained a pretty stable ratio of about one full-time professor for every 25 students in the university system for the past 40 years, and this hasn't changed at all. So while adjunct growth has in fact occurred, it's been supplemental to this stable 25 to 1 pattern that we've seen as far back as we have data.
So in that case, I assume students are taking the same number of classes. So that would mean that full-time faculty are teaching less. Is that the case?
Well, in some cases it is, although we've looked at some survey data, that's only true at the top tier elite research universities. So if you're a professor at Harvard, you're a professor at Princeton, there's a high chance that you're focusing heavily on your research and you're buying out some of your classes, or you have, as part of your hiring deal, you have a reduced teaching load with that specific purpose of focusing on research. But the average student in the United States isn't going to Harvard. The average student is attending probably a large public university, sometimes a small liberal arts college. And the survey data on what faculty do at these institutions, the more middle-of-the-road typical institutions tend to have about the same teaching load as they did 15, 20 years ago. So full-time faculty are still teaching a fairly rigorous teaching load. It just hasn't translated in the same way as we see at the elite universities. But what we do see in the adjunct hiring, that has increased for, I think, two reasons that I would offer as an explanation. The first is it's always good on paper to have a very low faculty to student ratio. Administrators love this kind of thing. They put it in their advertising. They put it in their self-reporting to get their program ranked high. So all sorts of benefits that come from that. And the more faculty you hire, do the simple math there, the average number of students in the classroom drops. But the second reason, and I think this is really student-driven, is that students are increasingly liking courses that are offered at non-traditional hours and times, so like a Wednesday evening, one course a week type of a program, or sometimes they like weekend programs. So there's greater demand for flexibility on when courses are offered. And the adjunct expansion is in many ways catering to this. So instead of having your classes 3 days a week between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. as a traditional university student would be, a lot of these are adults going back for a further degree, so continuing education. Sometimes people that are taking classes part-time. If you can take a class on a Wednesday night and there's an adjunct professor available to do that, the university has an incentive to hire that type of a role just to expand the number of course offerings.
Okay, so in this view, then it's a response to demand, and people want a different kind of service, and that gets provided by a different kind of worker. But a lot of this controversy was seeing it from a perspective of sort of workers' rights and seeing adjuncts as being pretty badly mistreated. So, what is there in those complaints? What is the life of an adjunct like?
Right. So I guess we can start with definitions. So a typical adjunct is hired on a per course basis. There are all sorts of different ways to adjunct as a career. So and the survey data kind of breaks this up. I'll start with the group that we consider kind of like the full-time adjunct. And I know that kind of sounds like a contradiction in terms, but a full-time adjunct is typically someone who strings together 3, 4, maybe 5 classes per semester. Some of them are not at the same university. So it may be someone that lives in New York City but travels between 3 different classes in the greater tri-state area at different universities. And they're typically paid pretty low relative to what a typical professor makes. So I think the national average hovers around $3,000 per class for an adjunct taught typical 3 hours a week type of a classroom. So we have a segment of the adjunct workforce that falls into this category of full-time adjuncts, and they're usually the ones that get the attention in higher ed press coverage of the adjunct plight, the adjunct crisis. They're also a relatively small portion of the adjunct population. So there have been different types of studies. One survey that I was just looking at a few minutes ago actually estimated that the full-time adjunct workforce may be as few as 5% of the adjunct population. And that's a measure using people that work at 2 or more universities. And actually, if you cut it down to adjuncts that only work at one university, that's the vast majority of them.
Okay.
There's another segment of the adjunct population that are simply people with other careers that are moonlighting in the classroom. So we call them the moonlighting adjunct. This could be someone who's like a trial lawyer during the day, but teaches one night a week at the local law school. Could be a journalist that has a part-time teaching gig at the local university. And that person's brought in there for obvious reasons because of their acclaim, because of their professional status. This is a very different segment of the workforce. These are people that have other sources of income, other income streams, but they work in the university because they either enjoy it or they want to give back to the community, or maybe they want to keep one foot in the door of intellectual life. So any number of different reasons that those type of people adjunct. I raise this as an issue because they have a very different type of a job market than the higher ed coverage that focuses on the full-time adjuncts, the beleaguered adjuncts that are underpaid that we read about in the news all the time. And then finally, there's a third segment of the adjunct market, in addition to the moonlighting professionals, in addition to the people that are trying to make a career only out of adjuncting. And these are people that only want part-time work. So there's a segment of the adjunct population that may be retirees, so professors that retired from a full-time job somewhere else but still wants to keep up intellectual life, so they'll teach one course in political science at the local college. Or it could be a grad student that's finishing up a PhD program and is busy writing a dissertation, but adjuncts on the side for an additional source of income stream or maybe classroom experience. And I raise these categories because oftentimes people that fall into that situation don't want more than 1 or 2 adjunct classes. So it's a very diverse type of a workforce, but the discussion of it is almost entirely centered upon one single segment, and that's the people that are trying to make nothing more than just a career out of doing nothing more than adjuncting. And that's where you get some of the labor issues that are raised up. That's where you get the heated rhetoric. So we actually have done some statistical analysis of that segment of the workforce, and it's an attempt to really try to unclutter the discussion. And I say uncluttering because if you read the way that this is covered in the press, it's often done in very heightened hyperbolic language. So adjuncting is described as exploitative. There were even a few articles out there that call it modern day slavery, which I think is actually kind of offensive in a sense that you're comparing people in a wage job to one of history's most horrendous working conditions and institutions. But nonetheless, you get that hyperbole. They've been compared to sweatshop workers, all sorts of things like this, extreme exaggeration. And one of the articles that Jason Brennan and I wrote basically dug into the stats of this, and we found that these claims are just heightened in their exaggeration relative to the number of hours that are worked, relative to self-reported evidence of the type of work that people in these situations are doing. It's just no comparison to make between this and, say, slavery or a sweatshop. So part of our objective is to kind of unclutter that discussion and get us back on rational, reasonable, empirically grounded terms.
Yeah. So let's, do a little back of the envelope calculation. You said about $3,000 per course. And of course you could teach that's for 1/3 of the year, right? There are 3 semesters, spring, summer, fall. Yeah. And, if you were wanting to just do nothing but teach, you could maybe teach 5 courses each semester. So that's 15 over a course of a year, 15 times 3,000, 45,000 a year. That is not a bad salary. I think it's above average.
Right. It's not a great salary, but it's not terrible. That is a heavy teaching load, 5 classes a semester. Although if we even break it down by what an adjunct does in a typical course of a week, or what any professor does in a typical course of a week, that's roughly, each class is roughly 3 hours a week in the classroom. So 3 hours of lecturing, standing in front of students, administering tests and quizzes and all that kind of thing. In addition to that, there's going to be some preparation time involved. There's going to be some meeting with students in the class, outside of the classroom, so office hours, things like that, which we do take into account in some of our calculations. But even if you add that up over the course of a week, you are often finding for the average self-reported adjunct's work something that is more resemblant of what we consider a part-time job in the traditional private sector workforce than what we consider a full-time job. So,
right. The line for that is about 40 hours, right?
Yeah, but it's not a 9-to-5 job, 40 hours a week either.
Yeah, I think maybe part of the complaint is, you look at this, what credentials these adjuncts have. Some of them have only master's degrees, but if you went to all the effort of getting a PhD and you spent all of your 20s doing that, and you sacrificed potential earnings for a decade, then only getting a part-time job that pays, up to a max of $45,000 at the end of that is a pretty raw deal.
Right. So there are separate issues that come out from the academic labor force. And this is another topic we get into. We're investigating for our forthcoming book, and I've done a lot of the empirics on this, as the study of the overproduction of PhDs. And this has been a problem for academia for several decades in some disciplines. But the key to focus upon here is that not all disciplines are equal in this sense. So take economics, for example. Economics has had a relatively stable growth rate in the number of PhD students it produces in a given year. It also has a pretty good job market. Academic hiring in economics tends to be approached very close to full employment. So if you want to be an academic economist and work in a university, there's a very high chance you can do that, and by simply obtaining a PhD and applying for a faculty position. And those who don't make it into the academy, there's an abundance of other jobs in the policy world. There's jobs in government. There's jobs in the private sector doing business and finance type activities. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is a typical PhD economist is generally able to find a job where that person is relatively happy and pretty comfortable in terms of salary. We contrast that with another discipline, which is very common in the academy, and that's English. English has a horrendous job market and has had a horrendous job market for the better part of at least 2 decades, probably even further back. if we go, and much of this is due to the fact that English regularly produces more PhDs than they actually have hiring positions for. And I mean, significantly more. In some years, it may be as high as 40 to 50% of English PhDs do not go on to get a full-time job. And that carries over into the next hiring cycle. It carries over, so it means like the PhDs who did not get a job in 2017 are also on the job market in 2018, competing with the whole new class of PhDs that are seeking the same group of jobs. So what you have in English is there are far more PhDs produced than there are actual positions to hire them, plus a much smaller outside non-academic market. So whereas economists could work in the government, could work in policy, there are very few positions that hire English PhDs outside of academia. In fact, some estimates say that may be as low as only 15% of the English PhD workforce is outside of academia. So what you get is a glut in that market that carries over year after year after year. You get into a hiring crisis where you have far too many people seeking jobs in academia with English PhDs and almost nowhere to employ them.
Right. And yeah. And even that 15% who are in the private workforce, a lot of them might be underemployed. So if you were a bartender as an undergraduate, and then, you go and you get your English PhD, and maybe during the years you're doing it, that you have like grants and a stipend and stuff like that. And then you get your PhD, and then you go back to bartending. I mean, you'd show up as employed in this statistic. It just, you're employed, but you're not really doing what anyone expects they're going to do when they set out to do a whole PhD.
Exactly. And I feel sorry for people that are in this position. It's not a very good structure for an employment market to be taken into a grad program and led along a path where you think you're going to get a career doing what you want to do in academia, and then suddenly you graduate, there's no jobs. Even though this is kind of common knowledge, it's a bad job market. The fact that we are subsidizing the overproduction of PhDs in some fields is only making the problem worse. So one of the stats that we get into is looking at the long-term trends of the number of operational PhD programs in the United States. And even though there's a fairly heavy rhetoric about budget cuts and states slashing budgets in academia, which is kind of a mixed bag. Some of it's true. Some of it's a little more complicated than that. One clear trend that emerged, if we go back as far as the data permits, which is about 10 years, is that there are more PhD granting institutions today than there were 10 years ago in several of these disciplines. And some of the ones that have grown the fastest, expanded the most since 2006, which I think is the first year that we had a specific discipline by discipline data for a number of PhD granting institutions. English and several of these other humanities that are completely glutted in their job market, they've expanded their number of PhD program offerings faster than, say, economics or some of the social sciences and hard sciences that are a little more stable in their job market. So it seems like the problem is getting worse directly as a result of the way some of these disciplines are structuring themselves.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about how they're structuring themselves. And it kind of reminds me of multi-level marketing or pyramid schemes where, the only job available for an English PhD, if the only job available for an English PhD is to create more English PhDs, it sort of has this structure where, you just have to keep sucking people in to maintain the people who are already in. And, it is a big, when we say the English PhD job market is bad, we don't mean that people who get tenure jobs don't get paid a lot. They do.
Right.
There's that big payoff if you win, but it comes at the expense of the losers, the people who do get.
Right. So there's a very large payoff and not much in the way of alternatives to that payoff.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess what happens, and we think about this is where the public choice approach really comes to the forefront. If you think about why universities have PhD programs, why faculty like PhD programs, all the incentive structures align to keep taking in students and keep churning out graduate students. So just take a hypothetical professor who teaches at maybe not Harvard, maybe not a top tier state school, but like a third tier ranked public university. Students that graduate from a PhD program out of that university are going to have a severe disadvantage relative to the Harvard grad or even the large R1 state school grad in getting an academic job. They're going to be at a disadvantage just because of the lower rank immediately. And yet we see these programs are all over the place. There are hundreds upon hundreds of them in almost every discipline that tend to be low ranked PhD programs that don't do very well at placing academics. That hurts the students. But from the faculty perspective, would you rather be teaching at a low-ranked state institution that only has undergrads, or a low-ranked state institution that has PhD students who also serve as your teaching assistant, who also, as part of their stipend, can be a research assistant to you? There are prestige advantages that come from being a faculty member at an institution with a PhD program, even if it's kind of a crappy PhD program. And there are also pay advantages. So the average professor teaching in a graduate program gets a substantial pay bump. It could be $10,000 or $20,000 a year over a same ranked professor in the exact same discipline who only teaches undergrads. So from the faculty perspective, there are reasons, incentives that exist, not because they hate students, not because they want their grad students to fail, but reasons exist out of their own self-interest of why they want to be teaching at a program that has PhD students. Well, there's kind of a faculty pressure to keep this into the curriculum, to keep adding PhD programs onto the curriculum, which, as we see in some of these disciplines, it only feeds the problem further, because that means you're taking in more students that have fewer and fewer prospects of jobs.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate characteristic of humans that there are enough people who think, I'm going to be the one outlier who succeeds to, fill up these programs that have a 0% success rate or close to it. So,
Right.
So how does this play with the internal politics of the university? I know you've written about the rise of mandatory composition classes, and that seems like a pretty clear case of especially English as a sort of special interest within the university.
Right. And this is an interesting feature. It's the way that disciplines structure themselves. So Jason and I, we propose a new theory in our book. It's have an entire chapter devoted to fleshing out this theory. We call it academic rent-seeking. And what academic rent-seeking refers to is certain behavior among faculty and administrators as well. So it's not just a faculty thing. But it exists to it's types of behaviors that seek out the resources of the university and secure them or lock them into a single program as a recurring, stable income stream. So I'll give you an example that we use as kind of our hypothetical in the book. There's massive attestation in the academic literature that physicians have very poor handwriting. So I use this as a hypothetical example. Physicians, people that work as doctors, have very poor handwriting. There are all sorts of repercussions that even come about from this. For example, if a pharmacist misreads a prescription because of a doctor's handwriting is bad, what happens?
Right, you get the wrong drugs.
You get a case of an erroneous prescription, and things could be really bad if that happened. So the hypothetical we offer is, imagine if a medical school decided it was going to make every doctor who went through its program to take one semester in handwriting classes. Well, what would happen? First, you'd have to hire faculty that teach handwriting. And to hire faculty that teach handwriting, that's a very niche specialty. It's normally outside of the range of a typical medical school. If that were brought onto the curriculum, it would start to institutionalize its presence. And if you hire faculty in that, and some of them eventually go on to get tenure, what if it turns out 5 years later that the program's not working? Well, you can't really get rid of it anymore because it's a stable institution in the university that's become kind of self-perpetuating. Faculty that are teaching handwriting now to doctors would, for example, keep pressuring the administration to keep their job on the curriculum, even if it wasn't working. And we use this as kind of a thought experiment to compare to what we see happening in the English discipline, Also some others. So foreign language is probably the second closest in terms of data that we have. But if you go back to 30 or 40 years ago, there was a massive change that started on university curriculum. And this really is driven by a rise in complaint about student writing skills. Remedial writing skills are needed in the university. And you can ask any professor in almost any department, how do your students write? And they'll all answer, well, it's terrible. They can barely construct a sentence together. They don't know how to form arguments. It's one of the most recurring complaints that you encounter in the university system. And we as professors are constantly dealing with it. Part of our own teaching style is built around bringing students up to a sufficient level of writing that they can complete assignments and do so in professional ways. So this is a big part of pedagogy in the academy. Well, about 30 or 40 years ago, this problem really started coming to a head, and the solution that was offered was, well, we need to start making students take a mandatory writing composition class in their first semester. And this is added as something that everyone that enters in their freshman year would have to take. And one department in particular teaches it. That's the English department. So we find tracing stats over many decades of this, that the writing composition requirements have actually increased, supposedly to address this problem, which does exist, of student writing ability, but they've increased about 2 to 3-fold since 1974, I think was the earliest stats that we got. So typical student that entered in 1974 may have been required to take one writing composition class, whereas today that same student may be required to take 2 to 3 semesters of the same writing composition class. So it's come to grow exponentially in the university curriculum, and almost every university has some sort of writing composition requirement in order for a student to graduate. Well, the problem here is if you look at this growth in the curriculum of a mandatory general ed writing class, it doesn't seem to be yielding much in the way of results. The complaint is still there that students are not improving in their writing ability. There's also test data that they've administered, and a pair of sociologists did a massive study on university curriculum and university learning outcomes a few years back. And one of the tests that they administered took student writing ability, critical thinking skills, and other related supposed claims of a writing compositions class yield from entering freshmen, and then they administer a similar test at the end of sophomore year and see if there's any change, if there's any improvement. And they found no statistically meaningful or significant evidence that students were improving after roughly 2 years of these mandatory writing classes. So not only are they mandated now, they don't really seem to be working. What does this do, and what does this tell us? Well, these classes exist, and they're perpetuating and they're growing more likely than not as a means of sustaining employment for the faculty that teach them. And you have certain departments that have heavily invested in that type of employment, English being the main one for writing composition. So this has been kind of a way for the English discipline to compensate on its workforce for another pattern that we've seen, and that's the declining number of English majors. So English is no longer as popular of a major for college students as it used to be. The teaching workforce has shifted over into writing composition, all built around these mandatory classes that students must take, and that there's basically no evidence that they actually accomplish anything. So it's a massive diversion of university resources into one specific trajectory in ways that has profound implications for the employment market and curriculum itself.
Yeah, the funny thing is that we're sort of implicitly treating English PhDs and English faculty in particular as subject matter experts on writing. But, what they're actually doing their research on is finding new meanings in Shakespeare or interpreting the plays of Samuel Beckett or something like that. And I mean, if you actually, if you read a lot of this research, a lot of it is sort of written with a lot of jargon and what seems like obscurantism, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of super clear writing that could be helpful to someone who needs to learn how to write ad copy or research papers or just a really clear memo.
Yeah, and that's the great paradox of it. I mean, if you were to ask the average English professor, which class would you rather be teaching? Composition 101 or Advanced Studies of Shakespeare level 400? 99% of them would say that second answer. They want the advanced class because they're scholars. And I think this is true of any faculty in almost any discipline. Faculty like to teach the classes that they're experts in. They like to teach the high-level classes that dig deep into the subject matters and materials that they enjoy, that they like. So that's an incentive that exists there. The problem is there are not enough students that want to study at that level. There are not enough majors to justify those classes. What there are hundreds of thousands of students that fall into the gen ed categories that take that Composition 101 class instead. And especially if it's mandatory, if it's required to graduate, that's where the funnel of students are coming from. So you have faculty that want to teach these high-level, high specialization subject matter courses that are kind of thrown into the classroom to teach Composition 101 writing skill that's very far removed from their own area of expertise. And the result is kind of a collision of the two interests that so it's not even desired by the faculty that teach it, but it's the only way they can obtain employment simply because of the nature of where the students are coming from.
Yeah, and I'll share some personal stories about this. In my undergraduate institution, there was a mandatory English requirement, but it didn't have to be in composition. It could be in literature or theater, studying plays or, advanced literature or something like that. And and a lot of it was not particularly relevant to the kind of writing I do today. And in fact, I'd say none of it was. But they also added, in response to this complaint about their graduates not being very good at writing, they added a writing for economists class.
Yeah.
And they got an economist who was just particularly good at writing to teach it. And it was all about, how to do really clear technical writing with a minimum of jargon. And that was actually helpful. And so it seems like if you, this idea that the English and, literature and things like that are going to be the best writers and teach writing the best because they study writing.
Yeah.
Every field is based on writing. Every field is about publication, and so it's not clear that you need someone from a different faculty than the one you're studying in to teach you writing composition skills.
Right. It's so it's just been kind of an accident of history that it's fallen in the lap of the English department. Although English department has run with it. One of the oddities that emerges here is trends in faculty employment. I'm saying separate and apart from hiring, even though there are more English PhDs seeking English jobs, the total number of English jobs has dramatically increased as far back as we can go. And we have about 20, 25 years of data in the United States from Bureau of Labor Statistics on how many faculty are employed in each discipline. And what I did there is I took some of those statistics and compared them to the number of students that are graduating with degrees in that discipline. So a major, for example. And what you find is in the typical social sciences, some of the humanities even, and especially the hard sciences. So, for example, in economics, there are 0.4 faculty employed for every Bachelor of Arts or Science that's issued in economics in a given year. Sociology hovers at about 0.5 faculty for every degree issued. You get over into English, though, and it jumps substantially higher. It jumps to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 faculty for every English degree that's issued. So you have a massive disparity between disciplines, and I think most of this has become a result of the shift over into composition teaching as opposed to teaching 4 degrees in their major. So give you the raw numbers, there are about 75,000 English faculty in the United States today teaching in the university system, issuing maybe about 45,000 degrees a year. By contrast, economics, sociology, political science, some of these other disciplines, you have in the neighborhood of between 10 and 20,000 faculty teaching and issuing 30 to 40,000 degrees, depending on the discipline. So you've got these ratios that are way out of whack as a result of a hiring spree that took place in the English discipline to basically fill these composition courses over the past 20 or 30 years. And as a result of it, it's not in any way chained anymore to the number of people that are actually majoring in English anymore. It's chained to this general education curriculum of this mandatory class that everyone has to take.
So let's talk a bit about the internal governance of a university. I think people who are not in academia, it might be easy to assume that a university works like a firm and the faculty are like the employees, but that's really not how it works, is it?
No, I'd say that, and you hear this, that universities are often presented as if they're being corporatized, if they're mass marketing degrees to try and bring income. This is the big narrative about higher ed today, is that it's facing a corporatization crisis. And this is something that we challenge in the book, something that we go up against. I'd say a better analogy is universities tend to work like government bureaucracies. They have administrators that are motivated not by profit, not by the amount of money that they can take in, but rather by the amount of the perks of the offices that they can get and the job security that they can build up for themselves. You also have faculty that operate according to somewhat similar incentives. Universities are run through kind of a shared governance model, so there is a traditional faculty input in the administration side, although increasingly you're seeing administration growing, not so much at the executive level, but at the lower level bureaucrat type jobs that are filling in various functions of things that universities traditionally did not do maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years ago.
Right. That's sort of an interesting development there that I mentioned at the start. There's that you have written about the growth in the number of administrators in universities. So you've talked about how different faculties have changed relative to each other, but the ratio of faculty to administrators has also been changing, and that's sort of a strange development because a university is still a set of buildings where students come in and they take notes and someone writes on a blackboard and stuff. It's not clear what changed, and yet they're run in very different ways. So how has that changed and why?
Yeah. So I can start with the faculty side of things. And, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the podcast, we understand why faculty jobs grow. It's a ratio of the number of students that are coming in. And stats going back to the 1970s show that universities have typically operated at about 25 students per faculty that's hired to a full-time job. So this can be tenure track, it can be non-tenured, like a teaching position that's renewable, but all full-time jobs considered 25-1 of students to faculty. Well, that ratio has grown predictably as the number of students enrolled in universities has expanded. So I'm looking at the stats right here. In the early 1970s, there were about 400,000 full-time faculty in the United States. And up through the most recent number, which is the early 2010s, there's just short of 800,000. So it's a little less than doubled over time, but it's matched student enrollment growth almost precisely. If we move over to the administrative side, we have to break up administrators into two different categories. And this is the way the Department of Ed tracked it for years and years, although they've changed their formulas a little bit recently. But the two categories that they used is they had executive level or managerial level administrators. And you think of this as like the president, the provost, a senior vice president, senior deans, things like that have some sort of governance oversight in the way that the university runs. And in 1976, there were about 100,000 senior level managerial administrators. And today it's just short of 250,000. So it's grown. It's more than doubled, and it's grown at a faster rate than the faculty, but it's not nearly dominant. Where the growth in the administrative sector of the university has taken place is actually what the Department of Ed calls other professional staff. And these are the low-level administrators, the bureaucrats, the people that manage the student services office or the admissions office or student life and student activities offices. Some of them even manage things like dorms and residence halls. So to give you some stats here, in 1976, there were just under 200,000 low-level bureaucrat administrators. Today, there are more bureaucrat administrators than there are faculty. It's peaked over 800,000. So we went from 200,000 to 800,000 in the course of about 30 years. And that's what surpassed the number of full-time faculty that are hired. That's where most of the university administrative growth has taken place. There are multiple reasons for this. One of the big ones is increased regulatory compliance from federal and state governments that have been imposed on the university system in conjunction with public funding. So in order to get federal funds, you have to self-report a number of statistics every year. You have to make sure that you have offerings in these various bureaus and offices that did not exist in previous iterations of the university. There's also an increased pressure for accreditation compliance, so to maintain an ability to issue a degree and maintainability also for public funding. A university has to be accredited by a private accrediting agency, and there are dozens of these that they belong to. But the accrediting agencies approve the curriculum and make sure that the degree that's being offered is what it says it is. They have become more stringent over the years, and you need administrators to comply and do accrediting review. But then finally, you also get another category of the low-level bureaucrat administrators, which come from universities moving into non-traditional functions and fields. So some of these, some examples that we've seen in recent years, a lot of universities have created what they call sustainability offices. You may have like an assistant vice president for sustainability and an entire staff over them. Well, what are these people? What's their job? It's an entire office dedicated to making the campus green and reducing its carbon emissions. Maybe running a recycling center, installing solar panels, and doing green awareness campaigns on campus. These have exploded in recent decades. And oftentimes they're fairly politicized, as you can see with the subject matter. So that's a component of the administrative growth. Well, where does that money come from? It comes from the general budget of the university. It comes from tuition. It comes from state sources and federal sources. So all the money that used to be divided up on a much smaller number of tasks, large segments of it are being diverted into more and more peripheral expenditures on the administrative side of the university system.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many factors here to get into. You briefly mentioned regulatory compliance, but one thing people talk a lot about in the United States is Title IX, which was a policy that was supposed to. It was just supposed to make it so there was more funding for women's sports, and then it became it was construed so broadly that it became a sort of general purpose. All universities must treat men and women equally in all respects, and any sort of allegation of sexism of any kind within the university needs to have some kind of full investigation, and universities now need to have their own sort of mini legal system for dealing with sexual assault. I mean, most businesses, most institutions don't have their own separate legal systems for crimes that occur among their members. So that's kind of, I don't know if that's a big part of the story, but it's an illustrative part of the story. I wouldn't be surprised.
I think it certainly contributes to the numbers of hiring for administrators in these lower level positions. So like a Title IX office in 1980, if it even existed, it may have been just one or two people. Today, you'll have an entire staff associated with that because the functions of Title IX office have grown dramatically. And a lot of that does come out of federal government and Department of Education mandates to implement certain administrative directives and implement regulatory directives. The incentive being if a university wants to be able to receive federal funds or take federal student loans, they have to comply with these various mandates and directives. And that's often, or it's actually almost always a case to hire more staff. because administrative compliance does take money and resources.
Yeah, and I guess going back to the analogy of universities functioning like government bureaucracies, one thing that happens with bureaucracies often is you get mission creep, where you create a bureaucracy for one purpose, and the meaning of that purpose expands over time because those you've now created a special interest whose interest is in increasing their own role and their own importance. So like with Title IX expanding from sports teams to essentially managing and regulating all gender related things on all campuses everywhere. And do we see administrators acting and bureaucracies acting as their own sort of special interests within the university?
That's exactly one of the best examples that comes up. So public choice theory, there's a famous model of bureaucratic growth. This is from William Niskanen. It's the Niskanen budget maximizing bureaucrat model. And he basically depicts a scenario where an administrative bureau operator has all the incentives in the world to overstate his or her budget for the next year, to keep seeking the perks that come with that office, because that creates security. It creates a comfortable work environment. It creates a bigger staff that they administer. So there is this definite mission creep that takes place, and it's a technical model. So there are a lot of theories that can be derived out of it. There are a lot of tests that can be done empirically to show a Niskanen model in action. But most often it's studied in things like the Department of Motor Vehicles or the EPA or some major federal bureau. Those have been the examples where a Niskanen type situation has been described. Well, one of the arguments we make in the book is that this model applies very well to higher ed, very similar to the way that it does to the government, because you start seeing this similar type of budget maximizing, mission creep, hiring creep occurring in university offices over time. So, and it's not to say that these are bad people or anything. It's not to say that university administrators are behaving any differently than you or I would work if we were in that situation. It's just that their incentives align to constantly expand their budget, constantly expand their staff, because that secures job security. That makes a better life for someone who's working in one of these campus roles, gives them a bigger footprint on campus, so to speak, both metaphorically and literally. And what you see is over 10, 20, 30 years of that occurring, something that started out with a staff of 2 can blossom into a staff of 15 with its own associate vice president attached to it.
Is this all related? I hesitate to enter this area because, of course, it's very controversial. But is this all tied to the sort of shift in political skew of universities and the kind of activist movements on campus? And that's of course a hot button issue. How does it relate to these public choice elements?
Right. So, and it's a really tricky one to measure. I can give you the overview of what can be measured. And this is another topic we actually aren't getting into in our book on the universities, but it's something I've been exploring as kind of a next project. So many years out after this one. Main thing is faculty political opinions have been polled pretty consistently since the late 1960s. And it's just a generic poll where they ask people to rate, are they conservative, moderate, or liberal? So it's a left-right spectrum in that sense. It doesn't pick up any of the other nuances. You don't get libertarians on there. You don't get political radicals on there, but just conservative to liberal. And what happened in that pattern, this is among university faculty, major surveys that are administered nationwide on a periodic basis. It used to be every 4 to 5 years. And then since the late 1980s, they do it every 2 to 3 years on a consistent basis. And what happened is you traditionally had universities sitting left of center. So maybe like 40 to 50% of faculty would self-identify as liberal. But then you'd have a minority that would identify as conservatives, and it was a pretty stable minority. So you may have 20 to 30% are conservative, 40 to 50 are liberal, and then a segment of moderates in between, something of that nature. This was a stable relationship that existed from the first survey in about 1969, I think was the year, all the way up until around the year 2000. the ratio did not shift as much. So it's a majority liberal, but there's also a stable minority of conservatives. Something interesting happened after 2000, and I don't have an easy explanation, but I think it is tied to the politicization of the university, is the number of liberals exploded and the number of conservatives, self-identified conservatives, dropped. So now, instead of 40 to 50% left-leaning, university faculty self-identify somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65% left-leaning. So it's a massive jump that's taken place in a relatively short period of time. And at the same time, both conservatives and moderates have dropped off and dwindled down to a very small percentage of what they used to be. So the faculty itself has skewed leftward. That's an indisputable empirical fact. What does this mean, and where is it coming from? We need better data. We need to investigate this on a deeper level. I argue that there is some evidence that certain fields, certain disciplines are more politicized than others. So you very rarely get strong political opinions coming out of, say, the physics department or the engineering department. But if you go over to the English department, in some cases you go over to the history department, you may get faculty that self-identify as 80, 85, 90% on the political left. So there's a very, very pronounced skew in those disciplines. And those disciplines have also grown in size relative to some of the others in the university over the past 20 or 30 years. So that does help to explain why you see more and more political inclination rising to the forefront of what's going on here. Does it translate over into the administrator side? We don't know because we don't have much in the way of surveys. I will note that there does seem to be an explosion in the number of pretty overtly politicized administrative offices. So the example I gave on the environmental sustainability offices, these are basically entities with a political mission on campus that 20 or 30 years ago did not even exist. And today they have usually some sort of a senior administrator and an entire staff associated with them. So to the extent that administration is moving into things like that, you're seeing more and more of a political presence in areas where it traditionally just used to be regulatory compliance and processing admissions forms and processing student aid.
So a couple times during our conversation, you've mentioned your upcoming book with Jason Brennan. I don't think you mentioned the title. So tell us, I know it's not out yet, but tell us what that book is going to be and what's the general overview.
Yeah, the title is Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Business Ethics of Higher Education. And it will be coming out on Oxford University Press. We're looking probably about a year from now as the release date. We have a finished draft of the manuscript that we're currently undertaking revisions on, doing all the editing that has to be done before that's put into its final form. And basically what it is it takes a mixture of public choice theory and business ethics and applies them to the model of the university system. So we walk through what are the incentives that faculty have, what are the incentives administrators have, and how do these come together in ways that affect students. So questions we take up is, are students getting the value for their degree that they're being pitched in university advertising? And the answers are complicated. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We also ask questions, why are university budgets growing in certain areas, or why are certain PhD programs producing too many PhDs relative to the job market? And it comes back to questions of incentives. But then on top of that, there's an ethical dimension. So, for example, is it ethically sound? Is it ethically right for a university to recruit PhD students in history if it has a really low-ranked history program that has very low chances of a job prospect afterward? And are students being fed accurate information when this happens? So we take up those types of questions as well, run through all sorts of different dimensions of the university system. It comes down to questions of how do they market themselves, how do they operate, what are the incentives, and then we offer a few suggestions around the margin of things that could be done to improve upon the status quo and maybe address some of the problems that we see coming to the forefront.
All right. I look forward to reading your book when it comes out.
Outstanding.
So my guest today has been Phil Magness. Phil, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Yeah, thanks again for hosting.
The discussion question for this episode is, what was your personal experience with mandatory composition classes? If you did an undergraduate degree, did your university have mandatory composition classes? And if so, do you feel that they were helpful to you or not helpful? And just what were they like in general? If you want to go answer that question, head over to the Facebook group, Economics Detective on Facebook, and request to join. It's a closed group, but we have some fun discussions going on there right now for this and past episodes. As a side note, you may have noticed that the audio quality is improved for this episode, and that's because I've bought some new gear for my setup. I added a preamp to boost the gain on my end of the recording, and the reason I'm able to do that is because of my generous donors on Patreon. So if you want to help the show and help me put out a high-quality product every week, hopefully every week, I try to do it every week, but I don't always succeed, then head over to Patreon and become a patron of the show. Thank you very much, and I'll be back next week.